holstered your lightsaber is.
This week we looked at a message about the conflict we must face, and as believers we're all in a conflict, and three things that we were in conflict with that we talked about were the devil, darkness, and death. And so I kind of want to focus on darkness, and when I think about darkness, I think about just Star Wars, the dark side. And we saw that darkness is mentioned 4 times in scriptures, and it talks about literal darkness or physical darkness, moral darkness, spiritual darkness, and eternal darkness. And if that is the conflict that we're in with, then obviously we are bringing light into those. If darkness is what we're in conflict with, the only way we can fight that is with light. So we must fight it with moral light, we must fight it with spiritual light, and we must fight the eternal darkness with eternal light. And we kind of ended the message with this reality that even in all this darkness, Jesus is right there in the middle of it. He's the light that's in the middle of this darkness, shining, pointing and directing towards himself. And as I thought about that, I thought about, Star Wars movies, and there's always this scene in all the movies. They're in outer space in this dark place. They're in some sort of ship or something, or on some planet that's dark, and there's this dark character, whether it's Darth Maul or Darth Vader or Kylo Ren or whoever, they're dark. And then there's this Jedi, and at that moment, the conflict really rises, and in the midst of that conflict, you see them pull out the lightsaber. And what happens when in that scene, in any theater or if you're at your house, when the lightsaber is pulled out, immediately your eyes go to the lightsaber. You're drawn. Your eyes are drawn and locked in on this lightsaber. And that's exactly how Jesus' truth is. That's how Jesus is in the midst of moral darkness and spiritual darkness. When he enters into those circumstances and situations, all eyes go on him, just like all eyes go on the lightsaber, and we track its movement. You can't not watch it. And so what does it look like for us to pull out the lightsaber? What does it look like for us to pull out Jesus in the midst of moral darkness and spiritual darkness in our lives? And because I'm afraid that many of us are in the darkness Monday through Saturday, and we keep our lightsaber holstered. And so the first thing I want us to think about is this. What does it look like to bring moral light into the midst of moral darkness? And every day we live in a culture that is surrounded of immorality and moral darkness. It's all around us. And so are we speaking into that? Because remember, we have Jesus, the light, the moral light that combats this moral darkness. And when Jesus is brought up, and when we talk about Jesus and the moral aspects of what Jesus brings into life and how Jesus views this life, people's eyes are drawn to it. Just like in that battle when the lightsaber comes out. People's eyes are drawn to it and they begin to see it. But not only that, what does it look like in the midst? Spiritual darkness. What does it look like to bring spiritual light into the midst of spiritual darkness in our world and in the workplaces that we live, or on the ball fields that we go to, wherever that is? There's spiritual darkness. We see it all over the place. And God is calling us to bring and shine spiritual light into those areas, to shine Jesus into the lives of people around us. And what's interesting is when we shine moral light into the midst of moral darkness, it actually reveals the spiritual darkness that people are in, and they begin to see the spiritual light, which then points them to the reality that they're on a destination towards eternal darkness, and that can be changed, and that Jesus has an eternal destination of eternal light for them, or God's presence. And so God has called us to be in the midst, in the middle, just like Jesus was in the middle of all this darkness that was going on. He was the light in the midst of it. God's called us into moral darkness, and He's called us into the midst of spiritual darkness around us so that we can speak spiritual and moral light in those times. And so are you pulling out your lightsaber? Have you unholstered your lightsaber? Have you unholstered Jesus? Really, have you let him shine into the areas in your life where you're seeing moral darkness and spiritual darkness around you? Because that's what we're called to be, the light in the darkness. If you want to check out our last video, click here. If you want to follow us on social media, just find us at sbcclinton. And if you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, click here.